All right, we are all ready for you.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and just stop my video here just to make sure that our internet is kind of dropping in and out. So just stop that here. And again, thank you for having me here today. I do want to recognize my co-advisors, Dr. Aaron Day and Dr. Esther McGinnis. Most of the presentation is going to focus on two of the research experiments that I did under their direction, my doctorate program. Just an overview here of the presentation today. I'll take just a few minutes and talk about stormwater as it is in urban areas. I'll talk just briefly on the role of plants in rain gardens, and then I'll move into the two studies. The first one will be cyclical flood and drought, and the last study I'll be talking about is our work with submergence, depth, and duration. To start with, as you all know, in urban areas, we have a lot of impervious surface, or another way to look at that would be surfaces that are not allowing water to flow through them. And it's probably not a surprise that in urban areas, we can have anywhere from 20%, even up to 85% impervious surface for residential and commercial districts. And you can see that in the photo right here with those impervious surfaces. That means we're going to get a lot of runoff. And if that runoff is not held on site, that means it's directed towards some type of receiving body of water, which could be a lake or a river. And just an example of impervious surface, this is just a bird's eye view of a new development in South Moorhead, just a few miles south of where my office is. And in case some of you folks don't know where Moorhead is at, I am located right across the river from Fargo, North Dakota. Again, in the southern part here, this happens to be a newer development. And when you look here, you can see a lot of impervious surface. We have blacktop roads going through here. We have concrete driveways and of course, those homes. Now, bear in mind, the turf grass that is here is doing an excellent job, essentially catching rainwater, allowing that to infiltrate and permeate or percolate, excuse me, through the soil. But again, when water is hitting these impervious surfaces, they're all going to have that water directed into the stormwater system, or perhaps even some other type of catchment. But again, if it's not held on site, it's going to go right into that receiving body of water. With increased runoff, that also means that we're going to have potentially sediments, as you can see in this photo right here, that cloudy rainwater. We can get a lot of sediment that is in there. Other pollutants, perhaps even some fertilizer could be in here, pathogens. And with all that water, again, going to a receiving body of water, we're going to have quite a bit of velocity. And that means we could end up with bank erosion if, again, all of this water is headed towards that receiving body of water, partly because we're going to have a decreased lag time. And when you think about lag time, if you think about a watershed that's not developed, when it rains, it's going to take some time before that rainwater ends up into that receiving body or bodies of water. But in an urban environment with a lot of impervious surface, again, that water is being channeled and it's going to get to that receiving body of water rather quickly. And again, with a lot of runoff, we can have a lot more sediment and other pollutants that could potentially be in that water. That's where bioretention or rain gardens come into play. They're used worldwide to improve stormwater. They can help with reducing sediment, reducing nutrients, heavy metals, as well as pathogens. Although sediments, we would have to be a little bit concerned about, because in order for rain gardens to function properly, they do need to drain. And sometimes with sediment, if a lot of sediment gets into a rain garden, those soil pores can get clogged. And all of a sudden now our rain garden is not going to drain like it is supposed to. And also with rain gardens, because they are for the most part keeping water on the landscape and out of the stormwater drainage system, we are going to decrease the amount of stormwater that is flowing into a receiving body of water. Generally speaking, the storm water that moves into that rain garden is allowed to either infiltrate and percolate in the soil, it can evaporate back to the atmosphere, or it's going to be transpired through plants. And I say mostly because some rain gardens, depending on the soil type that they're in, they may have under drains. And those under drains are there to help to make sure that those rain gardens don't stay saturated for too long a time. So when they are saturated, some of that water could flow into that under drain. And a lot of rain gardens have an overfill or an overspill, where if they get a heavy downpour, a lot of rain goes in there and they're filling up, they can then flow over into a drain. And of course, in those two cases, that water would move right into that stormwater drainage system. But again, a majority of that water could potentially be kept on site. This figure is just showing you kind of the basics of a rain garden. And generally speaking, a residential rain garden is just a created shallow depression, like what you're seeing here in the landscape. And it's designed to collect water from some type of impervious surface. In this case, it's collecting rainwater from the roof system. So that water that's going to move into that rain garden, again, is going to be allowed to infiltrate into the soil, evaporate, as well as transpire. For rain gardens to function properly, plants are critical, and I'll talk a bit more about that. And usually they're planted with herbaceous perennials, and sometimes you can even find some woody perennials planted in rain gardens, and oftentimes they are covered with a shredded wood mulch. The ponding depth of rain gardens varies. For many residential rain gardens, they're probably about 6 inches deep at their lowest point, although larger rain gardens could be even up to 18 inches, but a lot of that is going to depend on the water volume, because they're sized according to the area that the water is being collected from, and also the soil hydraulic conductivity. Essentially, how quickly can that water drain? Those are going to be the two biggest determinations as to how deep that rain garden is going to be. Ideally, in a rain garden, ponded water is going to drain within 24 hours. And then the soil pore space, the excess water, is going to be removed or drained within 48 to 96 hours. Here's another example of rain garden. And in this particular example, this rain garden is actually collecting water from this roadway, and it just flows right into there. And I was talking about if a rain garden were to receive a lot of rain, because maybe it's a torrential downpour and it gets overfilled. Here is an overfill. You can see that little black pipe that's right there with the screen on there. It could drain into there and go directly into there. In this particular case, when the rainwater enters this rain garden, again, it's allowed to move into the soil, evaporate, or it can be transpired through the plants that are in here. And this is mainly filled with herbaceous perennials. Ideally, with rain gardens, you are going to have properly selected plants, because they are important to help increase soil porosity and infiltration. And that's mainly done by the plant's root systems. If you think about plants as they grow, we're going to have roots that are going to die. As those roots die, those pore spaces in the soil are going to remain open as that root starts to basically deteriorate and decompose. And since rain gardens aren't getting tilled, those pore spaces are very likely connected to the soil surface. So again, we can improve soil porosity and water infiltration through plants. They can also take up some potential pollutants such as nitrogen and phosphorus. And they can also help with petroleum hydrocarbon breakdown. And it's not so much that the plant is actually taking up those petroleum hydrocarbons, but it's the root system. And plant roots, as you all know, are leaky. They're releasing oxygen, and a bunch of root exudates are being released from those roots. And the oxygen and those root exudates are being used by soil microorganisms. So there's a flourishing microorganism population right around root systems of plants. And that is going to help to support that microbiology, and it's the microbes that are doing most of the breakdown of the petroleum hydrocarbons. And again, plants being in rain gardens, they are helping to transpire water. which is going to be useful. It is important to think about the plants that are growing in a rain garden, because generally speaking, rain gardens are not watered, and therefore they're relying solely on rainfall. Therefore, at times when we have rain, those plants are going to be in a flooded soil. Other times, they're likely going to experience drought. So they need to be tolerant to both cyclical flood and drought. And if we do happen to have frequent rainfall, we might have prolonged flooding in rain gardens. Therefore, they might even have to tolerate some duration of actual partial or even complete submergence, depending on the depth of the rain garden and the height of the plants growing there. And if these plants are going to be used for rain gardens in residential or even commercial areas, they need to be aesthetically pleasing. For the two studies that I'm going to be talking about, we selected 7 commonly recommended species of perennial ornamental grasses. And again, they're commonly recommended for rain gardens, but there wasn't a whole lot of data that would warrant their use in rain gardens. And for each of these 7 species, we selected just one commercially available cultivar to use in the trial. And starting at the top, we have PIXIE fountain, tufted hairgrass, Northwind, switchgrass, red October, big bluestem, purpurescence, Chinese silvergrass, blue heaven, little bluestem, blonde ambition, blue grama grass, and Carl Forrester feather reed grass. These plants do encompass 4 of the 5 wetland indicator categories that I'll talk about in just a moment here. And we also have a combination of C3 and C4 plants. We mostly have C4 plants with the exception of tufted hairgrass and feather reed grass. Both of those are C3. Going back to the wetland indicator categories, we have facultative wetland. And if you're not real familiar with the wetland indicator categories, if you look down at the bottom here, facultative wetland, this would be a plant that usually occurs in wetlands, but it may occur in non-wetlands. A facultative plant would be a plant that occurs in wetlands and non-wetlands. A facultative upland plant would be a plant that would usually occur in non-wetlands, but may occur in wetlands. And an upland plant would be a plant that almost never occurs in a wetland. Here's a representation of the grasses that we used. In some cases, it is just the species, and in other cases, it is the actual cultivar that we used for the trial. So starting in the top left corner and then going clockwise, we have tufted hairgrass, Northwind, switchgrass, blue heaven, little bluestem, red October, big bluestem, purpurescence, Chinese silvergrass, Carl Forrester feather reed grass, which is right back here, and finally, blue grama grass. For these 2 studies, we had 2 research objectives. The first, determine the effect of cyclical flood and drought on growth and survival of the 7 perennial ornamental grasses. And 2, determine the effect of flood depth and duration on growth and survival of these grasses. I'll talk first about the cyclical flood and drought study. And for this one, we purchased our grasses as plugs from commercial nurseries. We planted these into 2.8 liter containers, which is roughly a trade gallon nursery container. And we created a soil mix using a Barnes soil, sand, and peat. And that was mixed at a 4:5 to 1 by volume. And we chose this particular mix because it's very similar to a rain garden mix that is recommended by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. After these grasses were planted, they were allowed to establish for 3 months in the greenhouse. And by the end of their establishment period, you could easily pull these grasses out of the containers, and their roots were held in place because they had a very good root system. And then we ran our study, we repeated it 3 times from October of 2019 to April of 2020. In the greenhouse, we used a randomized complete block design with a factorial arrangement with 3 replicates. And our factorial arrangement consisted of our 7 grass species. We had 2 flood durations, 2 and 7 day, and the 2-day flood duration would represent a rain garden that is functioning properly, whereas the 7-day flood duration would represent a rain garden that is failing. And we had 2 drought set points, 14% and 7% volumetric water content. Using the soil mix, we did go ahead and produce or create a water retention graph with that. So our 14% treatment was roughly about minus 40 kilopascal or about 0.4 bar. And our 7% was 2,500 kilopascal or about 25 bar. The reason we selected 14% and 7% comes from preliminary studies that we did, and we looked at just the dry down and where we would start to see visual damage. At 14%, there was no visual drought stress on the grasses, but at the 7% level or volumetric water content, there was significant dieback. So essentially the 14% would just be drought onset and the 7% would be severe drought. And this severe drought, if you think about 15 bar is typically called permanent wilting point, we're below that again. That 7% was about 25 bar. And then we also had a control, and that was kept above 14% volumetric water content. And for that one, it was because it was kept above 14%, it was roughly kept at about field capacity. The way this study was set up is that these grasses would be flooded, and the way they were flooded, we would just take the container right here, put a plastic bag over it. So basically set this plant into that plastic bag and then used another pot of the same size on the bottom. And then we would just add water until it was flooded at the rim of the container. So these were flooded at roughly a ½ depth for either 2 days or 7 days, and water was added daily as needed. Once they met their flood duration, they were then taken out of this and they were allowed to dry down to either 14% or 7% volumetric water content. And that was determined using a handheld moisture meter that you see pictured right here. I would go out every day and take moisture readings out there. And once the 14% or the 7% treatment was met, they would then go back into their flood duration. And for this study, a species was removed once the 7-day flood and 7% drought set point went through 4 cycles of flooding and drought. At that point, that species was removed. Our data was collected from there. And then we did the same thing for the rest of the species too. Again, once that 7-day flood, 7% volumetric water content treatment went through 4 cycles, they were removed and our data collected. For the data that I'll be talking about today, we'll be looking at the living shoot count, shoot mass, root mass, and visual damage rating. All of the data, with the exception of our visual damage rating, is expressed as a % of the control and was analyzed. And we used an analysis of variance using the mixed procedure in SAS. We combined all 3 of our runs, and we considered run and rep as random variables, and we used Tukey's for mean separation. Before I jump into the data, I just want to explain this graph a little bit. For this one, you're looking at some shoot count, and it's a species by drought interaction. So underneath each of the species, you'll see that the wetland indicator category is listed, and our 7% volumetric water content is a darker blue bar, and our 14% volumetric water content treatment is that lighter bar. And if you look over along the y-axis here, this is expressed relative to the control. So anything that is above 0 would be greater than the control, and then anything less than 0 would be less than the control. And if you look across here, in almost all cases, that 7% volumetric water content treatment within a species was always significantly lower compared with the 14% volumetric water content treatment, with the exception of big bluestem. If you look at big bluestem, you can see here that there was no significant difference between the 7% and the 14% volumetric water content treatment. For shoot count, we also had a flood duration main effect. And for this one, the 2-day flood treatment had a significantly higher percent shoot count relative to the control when compared with the 7-day flood duration treatment. For shoot mass, very similar to shoot count, we had a species by drought interaction. And again, in almost all cases, within a species, that 7% volumetric water content treatment was significantly lower when compared to the 14% volumetric water content treatment. However, this time it was little BLUESTEM where the 7% and the 14% volumetric water content treatments were similar. For root mass, a similar story, except this go around, there were no significant differences within a species for the 7% volumetric water content treatment and the 14% volumetric water content treatment for big BLUESTEM, little BLUESTEM, and blue grama grass. Also for root mass, we had a flood duration main effect. And here, just similar to some of the data I showed you before, the 2-day flood had a significantly higher percent root mass relative to the control when compared with the 7-day flood duration treatment. Before I get into the visual damage rating, I want to explain a little bit as how that was done. What you're looking at here is purpurescent Chinese silvergrass, and this was taken from our 14% volumetric water content treatment. On the far left, you have the control, so it was kept roughly about field capacity. In the middle, you have the 2-day flood, and at the far right, you have our 7-day flood. With the visual damage rating, the grasses were rated on a 1 to 10 scale, and you see here the control, the 2-day, the 7-day, they all had a rating of 1, and that 1 would be from 1 to 10% shoot dieback of the plant. If a grass happened to have a rating of 4, it would have been 31 to 40% dieback. If it had a rating of 8, it would be 71 to 80% dieback, and a rating of 10 would be 91 to 100% dieback. And also on the pictures, if you can see this right here, that 0.5, that's 0.5 or a half a meter. So just kind of giving you an idea on height. Now, if you look at the 7% volumetric water content treatment, the same grass species, you notice a big difference. Control, of course, is still at 1, but our 2-day now has a rating of 8. So again, 71 up to 80% dieback, and our 7-day flood had a rating of 10. So even though it had a rating of 10, in this case, it wasn't quite dead because that rating of 10 is anywhere from 91 up to 100% dieback. So not a whole lot to look at for that 7-day flood treatment when it dried down to 7% volumetric water content, but there is still life there. Looking at the data, we had a species main effect. And you look on here, you can see tufted hairgrass had the highest damage, but it wasn't significantly higher when compared with blue grama grass. And then switchgrass, big BLUESTEM, Chinese silvergrass, and little BLUESTEM, they had the lowest visual damage ratings, but not significantly lower when compared to feather reed grass. We also had a flood main effect for a visual damage rating, where our 2-day flood had a significantly lower visual damage rating when compared with the 7-day flood duration treatment. And probably not a surprise that there was a drought main effect. And you can see here that 7% volumetric water content treatment was tough on the grasses. It had a significantly higher, almost a rating of 7, compared with our 14% volumetric water content treatment, where they were just under a rating of 2 for the visual damage rating. And I wanted to show you a picture of big BLUESTEM. This is Red October. If you recall, in where it was a species main effect, Red October big BLUESTEM actually had the lowest visual damage rating. And on the far left here, you see the control had a rating of 1, and our 14% volumetric water content, this one had a damage rating of 2. And then if you look at the 7% volumetric water content treatment, it only had a rating of 4. And when you look across those plants, you can certainly see that drought had an impact on size. But overall, I mean, the plant looks pretty good. So we were pretty impressed with Big Bluestem, how it fared here. I want to mention just a little bit on grass survival. And in this table on the far left, we have our grass species. Then we have our flood duration in days, our drought set point given in percent, and then the number of plants dead. And this would be out of 9. So we didn't lose a tremendous amount of plants by any means, but we did lose 3 plants of tufted hairgrass. And then we lost only 2 little bluestem plants. And that was only from the 7-day flood duration that then dried down to the 7% volumetric water content. And then we lost 5 blue grama grasses, but most of those were in the toughest treatment where they were flooded for 7 days, followed by a dry down to 7% volumetric water content. And we only lost 1 feather reed grass plant. So in conclusion for this study, switchgrass, Chinese silvergrass, and big bluestem survived all flood and drought treatments. The ornamental grasses that we trialed, again, these 7 species using 1 cultivar of each of those 7 species, they were adaptable to cyclical flood and drought, and all the cultivars performed well if the substrate volumetric water content did not drop below 14%. Of course, severe drought, which was at 7% treatment, reduced the relative shoot count, shoot mass, root mass, as well as decreased ornamental value. And the study also shows that ornamental grasses that are used in rain gardens at times of drought, they may need supplemental irrigation just to keep up, just to help them keep growing and to maintain their aesthetic appeal. Our second research question dealt with submergence depth and duration, because the first study looked at cyclical flood and drought, but our flooding there was only about a ½ inch above the soil surface. So with this study, we were looking at a little bit deeper submergence depths. So for here, essentially the same setup as the previous study. We purchased our grasses from commercial nurseries as plugs. We planted them into trade gallon containers. We used the same soil mix, which was barn soil, which is a prairie soil, sand and peat, and we mixed it at a ratio of 4:5 to 1 by volume. And again, we allowed the grasses after planting to establish for 3 months. And then we repeated the study 2 times. And the studies were conducted from December of 2020 to March of 2021. In the greenhouse, we used a randomized complete block design, again, using a factorial arrangement, and we had 3 replicates. Our factorial arrangement consisted of 7 grass species. This time we had 3 submergence durations, 2, 4, and 7 days. Our 2-day would represent a rain garden that is functioning properly. 4-day would basically is a way to represent a rain garden that might be receiving frequent rainstorms. And then our 7-day treatment, again, is going to represent a rain garden that is no longer functioning properly. And we chose 2 submergence depths of 15 and 30 centimeters, or about 6 inches and about 12 inches. Again, 6 inches would be the typical depth of residential rain gardens. But again, if you got a larger rain garden, maybe in a commercial setting, that depth could be a lot deeper. And that's why we chose a 12-inch depth as well. And then we also had a control that was not submerged. How this study was conducted, we would take our grass plant, as you can see in the top right photo, and then we would place this plant into a 7-gallon pail, which you can see in the bottom photo. And then we would add tap water straight from the greenhouse, and we would measure the height. So that tap water would be added. So it was either 6 inches above the soil surface or 12 inches above the soil surface. And water was added as needed every 2 days to maintain that height. And once that water was added, the grasses were were submerged for either 2 days, 4 days, or 7 days. Once that submergence duration was met and the grasses were removed from these containers, they were allowed to freely drain for 2 days, and then they would go right back into their respective submergence treatment. The study was ended after the 7-day submergence went through 4 cycles of submergence. The data that I'll talk about today includes shoot mass, root mass, and the visual damage rating. And the visual damage rating was done the same as the previous study. Our data was expressed as a percentage of the control and analyzed, with the exception of the visual damage rating. We used an analysis of variance using the mixed procedure in SAS. We combined our 2 runs. We considered our rep and run as random variables, and we used Tukey's for mean separation. For shoot mass, we did have a duration by depth interaction, which is kind of interesting because it only occurred for the 4-day submergence. And when you look at this graph here, again, same setup. If it's above 0, it'd be greater than the control. Less than 0 would be less than the control. And our light blue would be our 15 centimeter depth, and our dark blue is our 30 centimeter depth. And we have 2-day, 4-day, and 7-day duration. Again, the significant difference occurred for 4-day, with the 4-day submergence duration, where the 15 centimeter depth had a significantly higher percent shoot mass relative to the control when compared with the 30 centimeter depth. But again, this was not realized in the 2-day or the 7-day submergence duration treatments. For shoot mass, we had a species main effect. Switchgrass had the highest percent shoot mass relative to the control, although not significantly higher when compared with little bluestem and feather reed grass, while Chinese silvergrass and tufted hairgrass had the lowest percent shoot mass relative to the control, but not significantly lower when you compare it with big bluestem and blue grama grass. For root mass, again, we have a species main effect. This time we have little bluestem that has the highest percent root mass relative to the control, although not significantly higher when compared with big bluestem. And similar to the shoot mass, you can see tufted hairgrass in this go around actually had the lowest. It was pretty close to the bottom with shoot mass too, but it had the lowest root mass, although not significantly lower when compared with feather reed grass. We also had a duration main effect for root mass, which is probably doesn't come as a surprise, where our 2-day submergence duration treatment had a significantly higher percent root mass relative to the control when you compare that to the 7-day submergence duration treatment. And with our visual damage rating, this one was a little bit interesting. So we have our species again going across the bottom, and then we have our submergence durations are given in green, gold, and what's coming across on my screen is kind of an orange. So our 2-day is in green, our 4-day submergence is in gold, and then the 7-day submergence again is in the orange one. And I want to draw your attention first to tufted hairgrass and big bluestem. And when you look at the visual damage rating, even for the 2-day submergence duration, it was over 6, quite a bit of dieback. And if you look at significance for tufted hairgrass and big bluestem within a species, there were no significant differences among those treatments. They were all pretty bad. Now, if you look at switchgrass and Chinese silvergrass, they did pretty good, whether it was 2-day, 4-day, or the 7-day submergence duration treatment. Again, within a species, no significant difference among those treatments. They did very well. And even if you look at the 2-day submergence duration for little bluestem, blue grama grass, feather reed grass, they did pretty well. For little bluestem and blue grama grass, the 2-day submergence duration treatment had a significantly lower visual damage rating when you would compare it with the 7-day submergence duration treatment, whereas feather reed grass, the 2-day and the 4-day submergence duration treatments had a significantly lower visual damage rating when compared with feather reed grass. So again, looking at this figure, tufted hairgrass and big bluestem did not do well with submergence. Switchgrass, Chinese silvergrass did pretty good. Little bluestem, blue grama grass, and feather reed grass did okay at the lower submergence duration. We also had a interaction between the submergence duration and depth. And in this particular graph, again, our light blue is our 15 centimeter depth, dark blue is our 30 centimeter depth. And for the 2-day treatment, no significant differences between those two submergence depths. The interaction occurred for 4-day and 7-day. Looking at the 4-day first, you can see the 15 centimeter depth had a significantly lower visual damage rating when compared with the 30 centimeter depth duration treatment. And the same is true for our 7-day treatment, where that 15 centimeter submergence depth had a significantly lower visual damage rating when compared with the 7-day, when compared with the 30 centimeter depth treatment, which doesn't come as a surprise. You know, the longer that water is in there, the deeper the depth, one would expect a bit more damage. And I want to mention just a little bit about tufted hairgrass. And you recalled earlier when I was talking about Chinese silvergrass to look at the height on here. And again, this is a 1/2 meter if you kind of ran that straight across on there. And you're looking at PIXIE fountain tufted hairgrass, the 30 centimeter depth treatment. On the far left, we have our control, which had a visual damage rating of 1. And then going to the right, we have our 2-day, 4-day, and our 7-day, which had visual damage ratings of 8, 10, and 10 respectively. One of the reasons we think that tufted hairgrass did so poorly is that at that 30 centimeter depth, most of the plant was actually submerged, and a lot of the plant was submerged even at that 15 centimeter depth, but this was the shortest grass that we had in the study. And again, in these treatments, a lot to almost all of the plant was submerged, and we feel that probably had a large impact as to why PIXIE fountain tufted hairgrass did so poorly. And the last picture I want to show you here is of Northwind switchgrass. And remember, this one did really well. But if you look at that 0.5 meter mark, or that 1/2 meter mark on here again, going across, this is a taller grass, and you're looking at the 30 centimeter depth treatment. Control is on our left, followed by the 2-day, 4-day, and 7-day. And you look at the visual damage rating, the highest was on our 4-day submergence duration treatment, and that only had a visual damage rating of 2. So overall, you know, these Northwind switchgrass did fairly well. And if you recall, even looking back at the cyclical flood and drought, Northwind switchgrass did pretty well there too. Here is looking at the survival, and same setup as the previous study. We have a grass species in the left column, submergence duration right next to that, followed by submergence depth, and then the number of plants dead. And in this case, it would be out of 6. And you can see we lost a tremendous number of tufted hairgrass in the 2, 4, 7-day durations, as well as the 15 centimeter and 30 centimeter depths. Although at the higher depth, at 30 centimeter, we lost more plants. We lost 8 plants there versus 6 in the shallower depth. The next grass that we lost the most of would have been big bluestem. And again, it just did not do very well with submergence. And then we lost 2 little bluestem and 3 feather reedgrass plants. So in conclusion with this study, switchgrass, Chinese silvergrass, and blue grama grass survived all of our submergence treatments. And again, thinking back to the cyclical flood and drought, switchgrass and Chinese silvergrass both performed well there. They survived all the treatments. Blue grama grass didn't do as well in the cyclical flood and drought, because we did have some plants that died, but in this particular study, they all survived. All of the grasses submerged for 2 days had an acceptable visual damage rating, except for tufted hairgrass and big bluestem. Remember, at the 2-day submergence, they were both above a visual damage rating of 6, which would be anywhere from, say, 51 up to 60% dieback of the foliage. Based on the visual damage rating, switchgrass and Chinese silvergrass may withstand longer durations of submergence. And we feel this underscores the need to keep rain gardens properly functioning to make sure that all that water is being drained within 2 days. And again, sometimes with sediment moving into rain gardens, you can get some soil pore clogging, which can lead to extended time of submergence. So maintaining rain gardens is extremely important. With that, folks, I want to acknowledge the North Dakota, Department of Agriculture and the USDA Specialty Crop Block Grant Program for funding my studies. They funded these 2 as well as an additional 2 studies. And I also want to thank Nathan Derby. He's a research specialist at NDSU for his help in the field collecting soil, as well as his help in the lab. And I'll just move through my literature cited here. And I will end on questions. And folks, thanks again for the invitation and your time and attention. And if you have any questions or comments, I will do my best to answer your questions. Thank you.